And as we do, then, here are some initial questions we can ask. We want to do a historical study. So we're going to basically jump out of the New Testament and do a pre-New Testament historical study. We don't know much from basically 400 BC with Malachi. I often call him Malachi, the last of the Italian prophets. But anyways, from Malachi, from about 400 BC to the time of Christ. Christ is going to be born about probably 5 BC. You say, well, why wasn't Christ born at 0 BC? Because it was, BC before Christ, the year of our Lord, AD afterwards. Actually, the guy that figured out the BC AD system was I think he was about 625 AD. And so he was 600 years after Christ. And when he figured things out coming back, actually he missed it. And you can understand, if the guy's 600 years later and doesn't have all the technology and stuff that we do, when he figured it out back, he missed it. And now we were able to, through various, I believe it was through eclipses, these eclipses that happen, we can identify exactly when Herod died, or in the year, and Herod died about 4 BC. And so therefore Jesus had to come before Herod, and so Jesus is probably born about 5 BC. Not a big deal, but it just, the guy at 625, when he was figuring out the BC AD system, missed it by 5 years or so, 4 years and things. And now we've got it a little bit better. But the point is, Malachi is 400 BC, Christ is around 0. We've got about 400 years they call the silent years. These are the 400 years that are between the Testaments. And actually, they really weren't silent years. There's much literature from that period. And we want to look at some of the history and things that set up the New Testament. So why, for example, is the Old Testament written in Hebrew and Aramaic? The Old Testament prophets and Moses and those spoke Hebrew, and so it's Hebrew. They went to Babylon and picked up Aramaic, and so Hebrew and Aramaic are spoken in the Old Testament. Some of the books, Daniel, Esther, some of the other books have Aramaic in it and things. So Hebrew, mostly Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic toward the end, Hebrew and Aramaic. When you get to the New Testament is written in Greek. Greek is very different than Hebrew. Hebrew is a Semitic language. They read from right to left, not as we do from left to right. And as Greek, Semitic languages, Hebrew and Aramaic are both Semitic languages. Actually very similar in some ways to Arabic today. Greek, on the other hand, is a Western language. They read from left to right, very much Greek playing the background for Latin. Latin picking a lot up out of Greek, and ultimately Latin coming down into the Romance languages, and even English picking up some of the Latin mixed with Anglo-Saxon, a bunch of other things, okay? So basically, what made the shift from Hebrew and Aramaic over to Greek? That language shift. Now you say, well, language isn't that important. Well, number one, language is important, and language does affect what types of things get communicated and how they get communicated. But the shift in language from a Semitic language to a Western language also indicates a shift in culture from an Eastern culture, a Semitic culture, a Near Eastern culture, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, very Eastern, to a Western, European, Roman, Greek kind of way. Those are two different cultures. The people think in different ways. They communicate in different ways. So what made the switch from Hebrew and Aramaic over to Greek? Another question that comes up. What significant shifts took place in Semitic Hebrew culture when they had to transition over to Hellenistic or Greek culture? Greek culture is basically built off Alexander the Great, as we're going to see, or I call him Alexander the Grape. But as we see the shift over to a Western Hellenistic, and they call it Hellenism. And so basically there's a shift from Semitic culture to Hellenistic culture. How does that affect things? What happens between Malachi, 400 BC, and the time of the New Testament, and actually much of the New Testament getting written down about 50 AD to 90 AD or 95 AD. So it's written, 400 BC to about 50 to 90 AD. What happened in that interim period? Where did a thing like the synagogue come from? When you're in the Old Testament, you don't read about the synagogues. When you read about Jesus, you read Jesus keeps going into the synagogue, getting kicked out of the synagogue, going into the synagogue. Paul will go into the synagogue, preach, and then get beat up and various things like that. Okay, so Paul will begin his ministry in the synagogues. Where did the synagogue come from? It wasn't in the Old Testament. The Old Testament focuses on the temple. The temple, and now all of a sudden in the New Testament we've got a temple and the synagogues. What happened there? Who are the Samaritans? Who are the Samaritans, and why is there such animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans? They seem to hate each other. At certain points they kill each other. Okay, so the Samaritans, what's with that? Why did the Samaritans hate the Jews? Why did the Jews hate the Samaritans? What about the Pharisees and Sadducees? Now we see in the New Testament, Jesus talks to the Pharisees and a lot of times rebukes the Pharisees, but at other points, the Pharisee, you've got a guy like Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night, who's a leader of the Pharisees. And so the Pharisees, Paul will end up being a Pharisee of the Pharisee. And so the Pharisees seem to be, on the one hand, opposing Jesus, but on the other hand, their message seemed to be a lot of the converts come out of Judaism, out of Pharisaism. The Sadducees, why is there a conflict between the Pharisees and Sadducees? Who are the Pharisees and Sadducees, and what's the difference? So we'll be looking at those things, and we're just setting up. So now we're going to kind of jump out. We're going to take and study that 400 years before the time of Christ. Okay, so we've just been talking about these points here, and I've kind of not pressed the button, and so I've missed the points, but this is kind of what we've been just talking about, okay? Here's the synagogue. Where did the synagogue come from? Here are the Samaritans. Why did the Samaritans hate the Jews? Why did the Jews hate the Samaritans? Vice versa. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees. By the way, were there other groups besides the Pharisees and Sadducees? There were other groups that were not just simply Pharisees and Sadducees, and we want to look at some of those as well.